Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Starting today and for the next few sessions, inshallah, I want to look at the life of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam, specifically the life of the Imams, but with a little bit of a different perspective from how we usually think about the lives of the Imams. Normally we think about the lives of the Imams and we're focusing on the particular Imam in question. So the birth, the early life, which of the Imams spent some of their time with the Prophet or with previous Imams, and then so on and so forth until the circumstances of their period of Imamat and leadership, and then maybe the circumstances of their martyrdom. And that's a valuable way to gain insight into the life of the Imam, but it doesn't always give us the full insight into the societal environment and some of the inspiring examples we have from the interactions of the Imams with their followers and their companions. And one of the ways that we can get the most insight and benefit from the lives of the Imams is to see how they interacted with their followers and how they allowed their followers to grow and to develop and become better people in the future than they were when they first encountered the Imam. And so that is the perspective that I'd like to use in these sessions. Gaining insight into the life of the Imams through the lens of what was going on in society, what was going on among the followers of the Imams, and how did their interactions show us the way in which the Imams would guide and train their followers to become better people. So we often see the end result, but we don't appreciate how that result came to be. And so we'll start with the life of Imam Ali alayhi salatu wassalam. Now, of course, Imam Ali's life had several stages. There was one stage of early childhood, even before the Prophet was publicly proclaiming his message. Imam Ali spent the early years of his life under the guardianship of the Prophet and Lady Khadija, and he was raised as a son. And it's actually very interesting that in Islamic traditions, in Sunni and in Shi'i traditions, we don't have the Prophet refer to Imam Ali as a son. The Prophet was known as the father of Zayd ibn Haritha, who was his adopted son, until the Quran said that people should be known by the names of their true fathers and not their adoptive fathers. And then, instead of being called Zayd ibn Muhammad, he was known as Zayd ibn Haritha, which was the name of his father. But he was still like a son for the Prophet, because he was his adopted son. And that relationship is referenced. But Imam Ali, who was younger, and who was raised by the Prophet from a younger age, the Prophet only referred to him as a brother, or as his self. So we have him referred to as Nafs Rasulullah and Akhu Rasulullah, the brother of the Prophet, but not as his self. And that's a unique honor that the Prophet gave Imam Ali, in spite of being like a parent to him, raising him, a father-in-law, later on when he married the daughter of the Prophet, and 30 years older. He said, "This is my brother, this is my self, this is my successor, but not, this is my son," which would be expected in that society. That first stage moved on to the early years of Islam, and as Imam Ali himself references in some of his khutbahs in Kufa, that early stage of the Prophet's life in Mecca, Imam Ali was by the right hand of the Prophet. When the Prophet was attacked, then Imam Ali witnessed who was saying what and who was doing what in Mecca. And later on, the Prophet, sometimes had many of his enemies seemingly make their peace with the Prophet. And Imam Ali would sometimes tell his companions that I knew them from before. I know their character, and I know what motivated them to become Muslims. In some cases, people who were enemies of the Prophet became sincere Muslims. But in many cases, people became Muslims for other reasons, because now it just didn't make political sense or economic sense to oppose Islam. And so that early experience that Imam Ali had by the side of the Prophet is something that he referenced later on, when people might have been confused and said, well, everyone who was a companion of the Prophet we should think good thoughts about. And the reason I mention that is because the big relevant part of the life of Imam Ali is really the period when the fitna began in the time of Uthman. The fitna is that public commotion about what is going on in the Muslim world and what is the way to fix it. And that is where the character of Imam Ali really begins to take a public and a very unique kind of a role. Of course, for the Shia and for his followers, Imam Ali was an imam even before that, but many people did not appreciate it. That realization was gradual. So the second stage of Imam Ali's life is with the Prophet in Mecca when Islam was weak and oppressed. And Imam Ali was by the side of the Prophet through all of those struggles as a young man. Third stage is during the time of Medina, after the migration. And now Islam is becoming stronger, but actually for the early years in Medina, Islam was still not fully established. So it was still surrounded by enemies outside of Medina, and even in Medina, the number of non-Muslims and weak Muslims, munafiqeen, people who would come to the prayer but they would kind of come lazy and they would maybe then speak against the Prophet or against Islam afterwards, that was greater than the number of people who were true Muslims, or even nominal Muslims. And so for several years in Medina, things were actually not that different than they were in Mecca, in the sense that you still had oppression and you still had a great deal of enemies. The type of animosity was different though. Now it was kind of hypocrisy and underhanded, rather than being a very public and a very overt kind of oppression. It was often people who claimed to be Muslims, but would weaken or undermine the willpower of the Muslims from within. And during this period, Imam Ali alayhi salam also played a pivotal role in the battles and in providing that solid support for the Prophet that allowed him to be able to spread Islam effectively in Medina, until about the time of Hudaybiyah and the conquest of Khaybar and then the conquest of Mecca, when the tables began to turn. And now Islam began to become not just one of the prominent religions in Medina, but it began to spread its political power as well. And at this point, there was a change in society. And this is now where our story really begins. At this point of the conquest of Mecca, everybody pretty much realized that Islam was going to win. Polytheism had lost the civilizational battle in Arabia. It was on the way out. So you had some tribes, they said, we need a prophet too. You had false prophets that came. Prophets and prophetesses. You had some people who joined Islam, but they didn't really know, if this was the winning horse. And so they joined Islam, but then later on when the Prophet passed away, they said, well, let's try another prophet who's still alive. That shows that they didn't join the Prophet because they understood the truth of his mission. They realized that this is now the way to get ahead. If you think of communist countries, people would sometimes join the Communist Party not because they actually believed in communism, but because that was the way to get a political appointment. And today in non-communist countries, you sometimes have people who join political parties or other groups because that is a means to get ahead. So they thought of Islam as very much like that party. You have people who made that realization just a little bit before the conquest of Mecca, and many people at the conquest of Mecca and afterwards, from Quraysh and from other tribes. So not all of them were in Mecca or in Quraysh. And then, soon after that, within a few years, the Prophet passed away. So, the challenge in the Muslim world really became whether Islam is going to be seen through a primarily political lens, or whether Islam is going to be seen through some other kind of lens. And if you want to understand the struggle of Imam Ali alayhi salam with his enemies, with his supporters, with people who were on the fence, a big part of that struggle is reflected in the change that took place around the conquest of Mecca. Or we can say between Khaybar and the conquest of Mecca and what came afterwards. When all of a sudden Muslims realized that if you're a Muslim, you're probably going to be able to advance politically. Military appointments, that military appointment was often a way to get wealthy at that time and get authority. You're going to be able to advance socially and in terms of prestige. So for a lot of people, Islam had an attraction for those worldly reasons. And unfortunately, even some of the people who were early companions, they also became attached in some way to the world. And so there is a misunderstanding of the Shi'i belief about the companions of the Prophet, that the Shi'i belief does not respect the companions of the Prophet as the Sunni community does. If you look at Imam Ali, and some of these words are preserved in Nahj al-Balagha, he speaks about the Prophet's companions very highly, but he speaks about them in terms of their attributes. One is prayer, one is worship, but one is also not viewing Islam through a political lens, in terms just of power and military subjugation. And these two different perspectives are reflected in a statement of the second Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab. He kind of knew who the candidates were for government after him. You know, like today, people talk about who are going to be the likely presidential candidates in 2020. And people are saying, you know, is Bernie Sanders going to run again, or is he going to be too old? Is Elizabeth Warren going to run? Is Oprah going to run for president? And people are speaking about certain candidates as being credible or as not being credible. So Umar ibn al-Khattab, he knew who were the people's preferred and potential candidates, one of whom was Imam Ali. And he has several statements about that. One of them is very highly praiseworthy. He says that if you choose Imam Ali to be the caliph after me, then he's going to take you on the straight path. But إِنَّهُ رَجُلٌ فِيهِ دُعَابًا. He is a man who is kind of humorous. He's lighthearted. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? He has a sense of humor and he's lighthearted. And you know, when he walks down the street, people don't miscarry their child. That's actually an incident that happened in the time of Umar. A woman was brought to him for questioning or interrogation, and he struck such fear in her heart that she miscarried her child. That was sometimes seen in that culture as being a good thing. You should be afraid of your government. Security and stability in society comes from fear. And Imam Ali, his personality was such that he might be sitting there, you know, in the position of leadership and government, and he might make a joke with somebody to put them at ease. And that doesn't fit what a military dictator or a general or a prestigious kind of hierarchical head of government should be like. So we see that difference reflected very clearly. That for some people, Imam Ali could not be an effective leader because in that military sense, he didn't strike terror and fear in the way that somebody who was less humorous, less kind of comfortable interacting with people as an equal would be. Not that he was not a military leader, and Imam Ali's life during the time of the Prophet and after the time of the Prophet proves his military credentials and competence, but just in terms of personality. So we see very clearly reflected two different perspectives about the nature of Islam. And this is also why we see that Imam Ali pulled away from actively seeking the position of Khilafat. Now, if the majority of people view the political leadership of the Muslim world as a political office, as a means for becoming wealthy, as a means for getting power, as a means for expanding the borders of the Muslim world, what good is it going to do for Imam Ali to be at the head of that system, where everyone who is going to be working under him is doing it without a realization of what their actual purposes are, what are their goals? And so right at the death of the Prophet, Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib is said to have offered a suggestion to Imam Ali, that give me your hand, let me pledge allegiance to you. Now, Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib was much older than Imam Ali. He was actually about the same age as the Prophet himself. So at least 30 years older than Imam Ali. He was an old man at that time. And after Abu Talib, he was not just a respected figure within Banu Hashim, but he was the senior most and perhaps the most respected figure within Quraysh as a whole. So he was not just the uncle of the Prophet and the uncle of Imam Ali, but we know the prestige that Abdul Muttalib had, we know the prestige that Abu Talib had, alayhim as-salam. Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib at that time had inherited that prestige. In fact, during the time of the Caliph Umar, whenever there was no rain in Medina, then he would invite Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib and he would say that, "Oh Allah, give us rain through the uncle of the Prophet, as you used to give us blessings and rain through the Prophet." And he had various motivations for doing that, but that kind of tells you the prestige and the position that Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib had at that time, even when Banu Hashim were under some form of suppression. So he says to Imam Ali that extend your hand, let me pledge allegiance. Who's going to fight if Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet, pledges allegiance to Imam Ali? And then we can take care of the Prophet's funeral, and there's not going to be any kind of coup. There's not going to be any kind of attack. And what does Imam Ali respond according to this narration? And regardless of the accuracy of this particular narration, it does reflect the reality. Because what we do see is that the Imam did not press his claim in a political sense right at that time. He said, my job is to take care of the final rights of the Prophet. It's not proper for the Ummah to go and say, let's break open the will and see who gets what money, and the body of the person who has passed away, is a prophet of God, is lying there, and let's divide up the assets and divide up the properties. That is bad form. And Imam Ali, he says that we're going to take care of this, and nobody should have a dispute anyway. Now, some historians have looked at this incident and they've said that it looks like Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib was more sophisticated and more savvy than Imam Ali. Because he knew, and he's said to have expressed that at the moment, that no, I know people are going to have a fight. So let's take care of this right now, and we'll always have time to, it'll just take a small time, and then people will talk about it, then we can go and take care of the funeral. But who is more savvy and more sophisticated? Well, if you look at it in political terms, then Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib's advice turned out to be right. Because during that time that Imam Ali was taking care of the funeral of the Prophet, what happened? Umar ibn al-Khattab was in Medina, sent a message for Abu Bakr, who happened to be in his suburban house in a place called Sunh, a few miles from Medina. It took him a few hours probably to get there. They got there and they went to Saqifa, and the whole event of Saqifa took place. So if this historical narration is accurate, then Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib's prediction turned out to be right. Imam Ali, however, was not saying that I don't want to do this because he couldn't foresee what people would do. What he was in effect saying is that if people want to go and fight about the political authority of the Prophet and not come to me and offer their support and affirm that they want to follow me for the right reasons, then I am not going to be part of that game. And I am not going to then assert my claim in such a way that they will approach me for their own reasons. So it was not a lack of foresight or a lack of sophistication on the part of Imam Ali, but it was a deliberate stance, a religious and a political stance, that I will go to these same people and make my claim. But I'm going to do so in a way that is going to foreground the religious and the spiritual obligation that people have towards me. All right. So Imam Ali did not assert his right very publicly right at that moment. Just a short time later, he and Lady Fatima went door to door to the Ansar in particular, because they had pledged to support the Prophet. And they said that, well, you know, it's too late now, we've already pledged our allegiance. So that incident, if we look at it through the lens of Imam Ali, he handled it perfectly, because he set a standard that I am not arguing for my right because I have any kind of desire to be a political leader or because of the power, because this is what is right. This is the way that Islam will be preserved. Now, we have several ahadith that are commonly misunderstood about what happened right in that time. And this is where we can start talking about the companions of Imam Ali. There were some people who were loyal to Imam Ali, but they kind of went into a little bit of a hiding period. They went underground, so to speak. And there was a large number of people who were thrown into confusion. So they knew that Islam was the true religion. They knew that there were a lot of enemies of Islam, those hypocritical or lukewarm Muslims outside of Medina and still within Medina as well. And they didn't quite know if they should now support Imam Ali or if they should make their peace with the government. And there was a lot of propaganda going out from various groups within the companions. Some people were loyal to Ahlul Bayt. Some people refused to pledge allegiance. Some people may have had their own reasons. Not everybody who opposed the allegiance was in favor of Ahlul Bayt. Abu Sufyan came and offered his support. Khalid ibn Sa'id ibn As, also from the Umayyad family, came and offered his support to Imam Ali. Zubayr ibn Awam offered his support to Imam Ali. So there were people who were vocal supporters. There were people who were quiet, and there were people who were confused. How did Imam Ali handle that situation? Well, out of all of the people, the one that we have in ahadith as the best response was one of the companions of the Prophet, one of the Muhajirin and the early Muslims, Miqdad ibn Amr. And many of you may know him more famously as Miqdad ibn al-Aswad. He's known by both names. The proper name is Miqdad ibn Amr. Al-Aswad was his adoptive father. And when the verse of Quran was revealed that you should refer to people by their actual biological fathers and not by their adoptive fathers, then he became known as Miqdad ibn Amr. But because he was known before that as Miqdad ibn al-Aswad, so some people continued to use that term. But Miqdad was one of those people who was among the most loyal Shia of Imam Ali. The four who are generally referred to as the early Shia are Miqdad, Ammar, Salman, and Abu Dhar, upon all of them be peace. Okay, so Miqdad is the one that Imams have emphasized had the best response, which was what? That he went to Imam Ali, he put one hand on the handle of his sword, and then he just looked at the eyes of Imam Ali and said, "What is my signal?" So they actually went and they spoke out in favor of Imam Ali. And that was sincere, but maybe not the best response, because sometimes silence is better than speaking out. Others might have silenced themselves out of fear, but they didn't actually come to Imam Ali and say, "Is this the time for silence, or is this the time for asserting what is right?" So even Abu Dhar, even Salman, even Ammar, they might have had a few moments where they didn't quite know what the best response is. That doesn't mean that their faith was not as strong as Miqdad. People have different strengths and weaknesses. But the right response, or the best response at that time, was to go to Imam Ali and to say, what do I do? If you tell me to draw my sword, my hand is on the handle. If you tell me to sheathe my sword, then I have no reason that I need to go and tell them off or I need to insult them. And he remained quiet. Now, ahadith tell us that slowly other people also got their bearings. It was a major shock. The Prophet had passed away. And there is such confusion within the Muslim world. So gradually the other companions, they also began to come together and to support Imam Ali. What happened during the time of the first two caliphs is that gradually people began to think back to the early events at the death of the Prophet. And slowly more and more people said that, we made a mistake. We should have listened to Imam Ali when he came to us, or we should have pledged allegiance to him right from the beginning. So gradually, we had an increasing number of people who would support Imam Ali. And this came to a head in the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab, especially towards the later years of his rule. He had changed some of the laws of Islam, changed Hajj, and abrogated Hajj Tamattu'. He had instituted Taraweeh prayers. He had banned Mut'ah, temporary marriage, and made some of these changes that some of the companions began to see that even the religious worship and devotion that the Prophet brought was beginning to be changed and modified. And so in Medina and elsewhere, people began to say, after Umar, we're going to pledge allegiance to Imam Ali alayhi salam. And that is where Umar gave a very famous speech. You may have heard the sentence attributed to Umar that let nobody say that the allegiance to Abu Bakr was a precipitous, unplanned, potentially disastrous act. The word in Arabic is falta. كانت بيعة أبي بكر فلتة وقالله شرها. So Umar said, don't say this, because that opens the door for you to say that, well, if Abu Bakr could be given allegiance without any kind of prior planning or preparation, then who is Umar to choose his successor? We will pledge allegiance to Imam Ali. It's a strong argument, right? That if the Prophet wasn't given a chance to appoint his own successor, or he didn't feel a need to, according to that opinion, then why should Umar? So he gave a speech towards the end of his life after coming back from Mecca, and he said that, well, that's true. The Bay'ah of Abu Bakr was a falta. That statement, which is widely sourced from Umar, it indicates that the later construct of Islamic history, that the Prophet wanted Abu Bakr to be his successor and appointed him to be the leader of the prayer in order to prepare the groundwork for him to be the caliph, that is a later false construct. Because if that were the case, and the Prophet were preparing the groundwork in that way, then Umar would not be able to say that this was a precipitous act. Right? The falta is something that happens kind of without planning, precipitously, and potentially disastrously. Which is why the immediate next thing that Umar said is, وَقَاللَّهُ شَرَّهَا. Allah protected us from the evil. It would have been disastrous. فَمَنْ عَادَ لِمِثْلِهَا فَاقْتُلُوهُ. If somebody does that again in the Muslim world, then kill him. Right? So we're not going to have any more of these, I'm going to do bay'ah to so-and-so. The reason why Umar said that, right, generally that's understood in historical terms to be a reflection of Saqifa. In the words of one of the participants of Saqifa, and it's a very accurate characterization of Saqifa. No unbiased historian can read the proceedings of Saqifa and not think of it as kind of an emergency council that was organized to decide things on tribal logic, not Islamic logic. Any unbiased reviewer of those historical narrations, in spite of the differences among the narrations and the contradiction among the narrations, that conclusion is pretty clear and explicit. But the reason why Umar said that was explicitly to prevent people from pledging allegiance to Imam Ali. So this is when the movement began. And this movement was headed by people who were loyal to Imam Ali. Ammar ibn Yasir was very active in that. And that is when Ammar ibn Yasir began to become particularly disliked by many of those people who did not want to hear that message. And propaganda and various types of insulting statements were circulated. Some people had an animosity to Ammar ibn Yasir from before, and at this point it began to become even more prominent. But the majority of people who later on were known as the loyal companions of Imam Ali, they didn't really have a special attachment to Imam Ali at this time. So if you want to talk about Imam Ali through the lens of his companions, right, in this last stage of the Imam's life, after the death of the Prophet, who is probably the most important figure that we want to talk about? The greatest of the supporters and companions of Imam Ali. Okay, so Ammar ibn Yasir survived to the time of the Imam's caliphate. Salman al-Farisi or Salman al-Muhammadi did not survive. He passed away earlier. Abu Dhar did not survive. Miqdad ibn Amr did not survive. Okay. Out of those who were there for Imam Ali, who was probably the greatest? Probably Malik al-Ashtar. Now, some people mistakenly refer to him as Malik ibn al-Ashtar, and that is not correct. His name, al-Ashtar, was not his father's name. It was his title. Malik ibn al-Harith al-Ashtar. Al-Ashtar was his title. So you can say Malik al-Ashtar or Malik ibn Harith al-Ashtar. There's a dispute about Malik. That was he a companion or was he not a companion? Part of the dispute is because in the Sunni community, if you're a companion, then people have to kind of excuse anything that they might not like about your biography or anything that might not be good about your biography. And Malik is a figure that, as some Sunni historians have said, is kind of problematic. So on the one hand, clearly Imam Ali had a great deal of love and trust for him. On the other hand, clearly he did not have a good relationship with Caliph Uthman. So if they praise Malik, the problem is that then what about Caliph Uthman? He was a caliph and a companion of the Prophet and somebody whom, in the Sunni view of history, is a pivotal figure in Islam. But if they don't admit the virtues of Malik, then they're also putting down Imam Ali. Because he wasn't just a supporter of Imam Ali. He was somebody whom Imam Ali took the advice of, somebody whom Imam Ali placed a great deal of trust in, and somebody whom Imam Ali appointed to the greatest positions of leadership in his own army and as a governor. And Imam Ali is also a caliph and a companion and a pivotal figure within the Sunni conception. But when it comes between Uthman and Imam Ali, who probably wins that tug of war? Generally speaking, Malik is not viewed favorably within Sunni history. You can kind of gauge the reasons for that, either because of his own biography or maybe because of the relative weight of Uthman and loyalty to Uthman and Imam Ali and loyalty or love for Imam Ali. It's a complex history, and for many Sunnis and many Sunni historians, they say that it's really difficult to speak of Malik. In fact, some of them will go so far as to say that, you know, one of the main excuses that Muawiyah had to refuse to accept the leadership of Imam Ali was the very fact that people like Malik were in the army of Imam Ali. So they will say that Muawiyah had a case. Imam Ali is giving support to people who had stood up and risen against Uthman. Of course, properly speaking and historically speaking, that would not be justifiable, and it is also not the case that Malik had a part in the assassination of Uthman. But you can see that from the Sunni conception, the ambivalence or the difficulty of reaching a conclusion is kind of clear where it's coming from. So Malik has that kind of a ambivalent biography. On the one hand, Imam Ali praised him very highly, and on the other hand, he was somebody who clearly had a strong opposition to Uthman. And so part of what I want to do is I want to look at the period after the Prophet's death in the life of Imam Ali through the lens of Malik. And we'll see how much time we have to look at a few other companions as well. But just this ambivalence that I've described, this will give us a little bit of an idea of why we have some reports that kind of indicate that Imam Ali didn't really like Malik. These are most likely forged reports, and they come from that ambivalence that comes within the Sunni tradition. So there is one report, for example, that Abdullah ibn Ja'far, and this was, of course, the son of Ja'far al-Tayyar, so he was the nephew of Imam Ali, and also the son-in-law of Imam Ali because he was the husband of Lady Zainab. According to this report, it's probably a forged report, but it kind of reflects the ambivalence that exists within the Sunni world about this period in Islamic history. It's one of the most awkward periods in Islamic history from a Sunni perspective, because you have companions fighting each other, condemning each other to go to hell, and so on and so forth. So, according to the narration, Abdullah ibn Ja'far comes to Imam Ali, and he says that whenever I would want to ensure that Imam Ali would not refuse my request, I would say, I swear by my father Ja'far. And when Imam Ali would hear the name of his brother, who was a martyr, then he would accede the request. According to the narration, Abdullah ibn Ja'far comes to Imam Ali, says that, why don't you send Malik al-Ashtar as the governor of Egypt? Because one of two things will happen. Either he will take charge of Egypt, and then now that province will come under your authority. Or he'll lose and he'll get killed, and then you won't have to worry about him anymore. So these types of narrations were circulated in history to kind of say that, you know what, Imam Ali didn't really like Malik. And he might have been trying to get rid of Malik. And the motivation behind that may very well have been the fact that the high trust that Imam Ali placed in Malik is itself a refutation of the idea that he would have been guilty of any crime, or that he was somebody who should be criticized or condemned for his role in the period of Uthman's caliphate. So let's go back a little bit then and look at that period of Uthman's caliphate. We said that in the early time of the prophets, after the prophet's death, for the majority of Muslims, it wasn't quite clear exactly why it's so important for Imam Ali to make his claim. What was the first answer of the Ansar? You know, we would have done bay'ah to you, but we've already done bay'ah to Abu Bakr. It's kind of bad form. And it's not a perfect example, but I want to just give an example from our own lives, and we don't have examples, you know, that are of world importance. But sometimes you have a family and they've maybe had an engagement, right? And then they find out something about their daughter's fiancé or their husband's fiancé that's not, you know, he didn't go to Harvard Medical School, he went to Columbia Medical School, or something, you know, that's not quite what they had hoped. And then you have to say, do we break the engagement, do we not break the engagement? Right? Now, clearly, if you find out that the proposal was somebody who had misled something, has a criminal record, is, you know, psychologically unstable, then it might be embarrassing. It might mean that you have to go through extra expense, but most families would be willing to support their child in breaking off the engagement, maybe even separation, if it's something serious. But there is a threshold that needs to be crossed, and if it's just something minor, they might say, all right, it's too late, we've already told people, you know, what's going to happen to our reputation, it's not a make-do. So the initial response of the Ansar seemed to be, you've done bay'ah to Abu Bakr, is it really that big a deal? He's a Muslim, you're younger, one day you'll become the caliph. It seemed to sort of be, they thought that you know, it was a minor thing. He didn't go to the college that he claimed to go to. He doesn't have, you know, the income that he claimed to have. Maybe the personality is not that great, but it's still doable. We can make this work. Right? So that was the state of the general Muslim community, especially in Medina at the time of the Prophet's death. In the time of the second caliph, especially towards the end of his life, things have changed. Some people are saying that you know, Ammar ibn Yasir believed that right from the beginning. But he was able to say that because now he had an audience. and people were willing to listen, that we should really do bay'ah to Imam Ali. What happened in the time of Uthman? This is when we see that changes really began to become visible. Malik lived in Kufa. He was from a Yemeni tribe, Madhij, and then the sub-clan of that tribe known as Nakha. He lived in Kufa, and he was probably about the same age as Imam Ali, maybe a few years older. As I said, there's a dispute about whether he was a companion or not. But generally, it's said that he did not narrate any hadith from the Prophet, and he probably had not seen the Prophet. But he was known as somebody of great courage, generosity, leadership potential, and he was the head of his tribe and his clan. So when did he, as an early Muslim, start to get involved in Islamic political affairs? Well, the early battles of Islam right after the Prophet's death, Malik participated in. And he worked closely and under the leadership of Abu Ubaidah al-Jarrah, one of the members of the triumvirate that actually put Abu Bakr in power. So Abu Bakr, Umar, and Abu Ubaidah al-Jarrah. These were the three figures that were most instrumental in the caliphate following the path that it followed. Abu Ubaidah passed away before Umar, and so he never became the caliph, otherwise he probably would have been one of the candidates who would have been put forward by that group. He worked with Khalid ibn Walid, and under his command, he participated in the Battle of Yarmouk. The Battle of Yarmouk was a battle between the Muslim and the Roman forces. It took place 3 years after the Prophet died in the 13th year of Hijrah. And he fought bravely in that battle, and that is where his eye was damaged. So al-ashtar means a person who has an eye injury. And that visible eye injury is where Malik ibn Harith now became known as Malik al-Ashtar, the one with the eye injury. And according to some narrations, he also lost sight in one of his eyes through that injury. So he was actively involved in a leadership position and in a commanding position right from the time of the Prophet's death. And he probably had a favorable impression of Abu Bakr and a favorable impression of Umar at that time. We have no evidence that he had any kind of negativity to the caliphs or to their practices, or that he had any kind of special loyalty to Imam Ali. What took place, though, now in the time of Uthman? And this is now a key part of the wisdom of Imam Ali. Question?
So if they were from Yemen, when did they move to Kufa?
When did they move to Kufa? The migrations in Arabia actually began well before the time of Islam. There were social and economic reasons for them, and many of these tribes had started to move north from Yemen, perhaps for climactic reasons, perhaps for economic reasons. Yemen could not support the population. So Aus and Khazraj actually had also come from Yemen at an earlier period. There was a famous dam in the city of Ma'rib, which is now in the news for political reasons, but was an ancient city that in pre-Islamic times the dam had broke and no longer could support a large population, and Yemeni tribes moved north. And then throughout the Islamic period, and afterwards as well, people from Yemen did move towards the Fertile Crescent, Syria, and Iraq. So Nakha, they lived, if I'm not mistaken, in that area of Iraq and in the area of the Persian Gulf, or within the Fertile Crescent, from pre-Islamic times. And then when the city of Kufa was formed in the Islamic period, many of them were among the first inhabitants of the city of
They weren't part of the Persian Empire.
Kufa. They were not part of the Persian Empire. Or they don't.
Became Muslim when Yemen became Muslim, basically.
They probably would have become Muslim towards the end of the Prophet's life. There were close relationships among those tribes. Yemeni tribes took pride in their Yemeni descent, and even those who were outside of Yemen, they still had family and trade links. Those who lived in Iraq and Syria, they still had family and cultural and trade links. And so they probably became Muslim right around that last period of the Prophet's life. And as we can see, Malik was involved in a leadership position in battles from the 13th year of Hijrah. So very likely he had been Muslim for well over a decade before that, during the Prophet's lifetime. But it's disputed whether he had actually seen the Prophet. But the most important point for us right now is that he probably had a loyalty to the Caliphate up until the time of Uthman's government. Now, what happened at the time of Uthman's government? Right? In Uthman's government, for a person living in Kufa, you had a governor, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. Now, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas was a companion, and he was an early Muslim. And yes, he was the father of Umar ibn Sa'd, and he was not somebody who was loyal to or supported Imam Ali, but he also was not a figure who was antagonistic towards Imam Ali. There's a famous hadith in Sahih Muslim that Muawiyah told Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas to curse Imam Ali. And he named 3 of the unique virtues of Imam Ali and said that I would never say anything negative about Imam Ali. So he was not a follower of Imam Ali, and he was not able to raise his children to be followers of Imam Ali. But that by itself is not condemnation. So even Miqdad, who I said earlier was probably one of the best of the Shia of Imam Ali, his son was killed fighting against Imam Ali in the Battle of Jamal. So now, Miqdad was one of the most loyal of the companions of Imam Ali, and his wife, the mother of that son, was also the daughter of Zubayr ibn Abdul Muttalib. So a cousin of Imam Ali, and a cousin of the Prophet, the Baba bint Zubayr. So from his father's side, one of the most loyal companions of Imam Ali, Miqdad. From his mother's side, a cousin of the Prophet and a cousin of Imam Ali, a descendant of Abdul Muttalib, and the son fought against Imam Ali. And Imam Ali has an incident when he saw the body of his nephew, so to speak, in the Battle of Jamal. So just the fact that the son was an enemy, that by itself is not a condemnation of the parent. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas himself was a respectable figure in the Muslim world at that time, and probably Malik was close to him. But Uthman, he dismissed Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas from the governorship of Kufa, and he appointed a person known as Walid ibn Uqba ibn Abi Mu'ayt, a member of Banu Umayyah who also happened to be a half-brother of Uthman. They shared a mother, Arwa bint Qurayz. So he appointed his half-brother. Now this is probably where, in Kufa, a person like Malik, noble person, loyal Muslim, suffered militarily for the sake of Islam, right? He's been injured, is probably seeing that things are not going so well. He probably had no problem with Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. But when Walid ibn Uqba ibn Abi Mu'ayt comes, first of all, this is somebody appointed purely for nepotistic reasons. Second of all, who was Walid ibn Uqba? He was the person who used to get drunk and lead the prayer of Kufa in that state of drunkenness. Once he prayed and he threw up in a state of intoxication in the masjid. Once he led the prayer and he forgot that it was Fajr, it should be 2 rak'ah, he prayed 4 rak'ah. And then after finishing the prayer he said, "Is that enough, or do you want me to keep going?" One of the members of the congregation there was Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was one of the senior most respected figures in Islam, companion of the Prophet, and he was responsible for teaching the city of Kufa about the Quran and about Islam. So if the city of Kufa later on became somewhat loyal to Imam Ali, then a good part of that was probably because they had been taught Islam and taught fiqh and taught Quran by Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. He was an early figure, and if you look at even Sunni ahadith about his recitation of the Quran, not Shi'i ahadith, because the Shi'i ahadith, we don't really have a lot of narrations about the qira'at and the recitation of the companions. But within the Sunni tradition, when they preserve how he would teach Quran, they mention that, for example, the verses that are about Ahlul Bayt, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud would say that this is about Imam Ali. This is about Ahlul Bayt. So probably some of that love for Ahlul Bayt that was spread in the people of Kufa by Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. So what happened? Abdullah ibn Mas'ud is praying behind senior companion of the Prophet, Hafiz of the Quran, teacher of the people of Kufa, praying behind a person who's drunk and saying, do you want me to pray more than 4 rak'ah, or is 4 rak'ah enough for you? Abdullah ibn Mas'ud could not tolerate that. Comes to Medina to object and gets beaten to within an inch of his life, develops severe physical weakness after that beating, and is basically dismissed from his position of teaching. Then eventually though, Walid ibn Uqba comes to Medina, is punished, is whipped for public drunkenness, and Uthman sends another governor. He sends Sa'id ibn al-As, another Umayyad, another relative. And he comes and is just as bad or worse than Walid ibn Uqba. And so this is now where you have people like Malik, people like Sa'sa' ibn Sohan, people like Hujr ibn Adi. These people begin to say that something is not right. They're beginning to want to rebel in some way against the injustice, but they don't quite know how to do so. I mean, imagine you've accepted a religion. Either you've seen the Prophet minimally, or you've not seen the Prophet. You've gotten the religion from companions, from second-hand sources. And now you're seeing that the people who are in charge of the religious institutions at the very least are undermining those very religious institutions. So Malik, Hujr ibn Adi, Sa'sa' ibn Suhan, these people who later on are loyal followers of Imam Ali, they begin to question what they should do. And that's where we'll stop today, that there's different places that they can kind of put their trust. It's not yet clear who is the leader of the opposition. It's not really clear what the opposition is. Should they rebel in military terms? Should they make their peace and submit? Should they find some other means of objecting? If you can imagine from where they're coming from, they're not Shia. They don't have any kind of clear connection to Ahlul Bayt. There's many different directions that their righteous objection could take. And so this brings us right now to the end of the life of the third caliph, Uthman ibn Affan, and the beginning of the caliphate of Imam Ali. And what we want to see is, how did Imam Ali respond to these people? Right? So he took them from a period of confusion and darkness and made them into people on par with the companions, even if they were not companions. About Malik, Imam Ali says that he was for me just as I was for the Prophet. So the role that I played for the Prophet, Malik al-Ashtar played that same role for me. So that was something that was not just automatic or by default, it was the interactions of Imam Ali that brought about that result. And inshallah, that's where we will resume next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.